I'm gonna have to ask you to leave. We don't serve beggars here." The words landed with the weight of habit, as if they'd been said before, as if they'd been rehearsed. Dr. Renee Marshall didn't react right away. She simply stood still at the marble counter, one hand resting gently on the wallet she had just pulled from her coat pocket. The young hostess didn't blink. Her arms were crossed, her voice louder than it needed to be. People at nearby tables turned their heads. Renee glanced around. The cafe was full. Hardwood floors, Edison bulbs, exposed brick, and baristas in aprons too crisp for anyone making minimum wage. On the back wall, a painted sign read, "Claret and Bloom, Experience Sophistication." She'd been here before, years ago. It hadn't changed much, except now she was standing on the wrong side of someone's assumption. "I said," the hostess repeated, "you can't loiter here." "I'm not loitering," Renee said quietly. "I'm waiting for my drink." "You didn't order anything." Renee opened her wallet, revealing a corporate Amex card and a folded mobile order receipt. "Actually, I did." The girl didn't even look. "Ma'am, this isn't a public shelter. If you need assistance, I'm sure there's a church up the block." Someone chuckled behind her. A man in a button-down and wireless earbuds. Another woman whispered something across her latte. Renee exhaled softly. "Let me speak to your manager." "He's busy," the hostess said, her voice dropping into something rehearsed and final. "Please don't make this harder than it has to be." A pause. Then, "Is there a problem here?" A man in his 40s emerged from behind the espresso machine. Tall, sleeves rolled, hair gelled like it was part of his uniform. The manager. "She was standing here without ordering anything," the hostess said before Renee could speak. "I asked her to leave and she wouldn't." The man's gaze swept over Renee with the precision of someone trained to make fast judgments. "Ma'am, if you're not a paying customer, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." Renee didn't move. She held up her receipt. "I placed a mobile order for pickup. My name is on it. It should be ready." The manager didn't even look. "That's not how we operate. Orders are claimed inside. If you're not comfortable here, you're welcome to wait elsewhere." The air thickened. Renee's tone didn't rise. "You think I'm uncomfortable?" He flinched slightly, then recovered. "This is a place of business. We reserve the right to refuse service." Someone took out a phone. A quiet buzz of anticipation moved through the tables. It was all performance now. Renee nodded once, as if completing an internal checklist. "Make sure the owner hears about this," she said. "I'll be in touch." And then she turned and walked out. Not fast, not slow, just with the posture of someone who knew exactly what to remember and exactly when to use it. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Outside, the wind pushed through the narrow street, carrying a few leaves and one crumpled napkin across the sidewalk. Renee pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and kept walking. She didn't need the coffee. She needed the moment to settle. By the time she reached her car, her phone buzzed. "Logan, 11:42 a.m. Meeting at 3 just confirmed. Seller's ready. You still want Claret's building?" Renee opened the message, stared at it for a second, and then began typing her reply, but she didn't send it. Not yet. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, watching through the windshield as another woman exited the cafe, this one dressed in designer boots, swinging a purse that cost more than some people's rent. No one stopped her. No one asked if she had paid. She laughed into her phone, stepped into an Uber, and disappeared into traffic. Renee looked back at the message, then typed 3 words, "Yes, full offer," and pressed send. Across the street, a pair of construction workers adjusted scaffolding on the side of the old stone building that housed Claret and Bloom. One of them glanced at her car, then at the cafe's sign, and shook his head. He had no idea that the most important meeting of the year had just been decided from the driver's seat of a quiet silver SUV. Renee didn't wait for a thank you. She waited for the papers. Because the next time she walked through that door, it wouldn't be to order coffee. It would be to claim the lease. By the time Renee reached her office, the sting had cooled into calculation. Her building sat 3 miles from the cafe, tucked between a law firm and a non-profit incubator, both of which she owned. The lobby recognized her instantly. Security nodded, the receptionist offered tea, but none of it was for show. It was function. Respect earned through structure, not image. She took the elevator to the 6th floor, stepped into the glass-walled boardroom, and dropped the folder onto the table where Logan was already typing at a speed that said he was angry on her behalf. "You shouldn't have walked out that quietly," he muttered, not looking up. "You should have burned the place down with words." Renee removed her coat, hung it on the back of the chair. "And given them what they expected?" He stopped typing. "You were mistaken for a beggar, Renee." "I wasn't mistaken," she said. "I was dismissed." Logan sat back. "It's not right." "It's not new," she replied, flipping through the folder. Inside were property appraisals, tenant summaries, structural inspections. The building housing Claret and Bloom had been owned for 47 years by the same family trust. Taxes rising, maintenance deferred. They were ready to sell, quietly, discreetly, and without losing face. "Current leaseholders?" Renee asked. Logan tapped on his tablet. 7 total. The cafe is the anchor tenant, 5 years left on their lease. The rest are mixed use. A florist, an interior designer, a boutique law office, and 2 upstairs apartments. Occupancy is stable, revenue neutral. But if we shift the lease terms, we won't, she said. We let the numbers speak first. Let the paperwork tell the story. He nodded, falling into sync. The trust wants anonymity. They're asking to close through a third-party broker. Fine. I'll go through Huntley and Moss. They'll want to know who's behind the fund. They'll get initials. He hesitated. Are you sure about this? Renee looked at him. I wasn't sure the moment she called me a beggar. I was sure the moment no one stopped her. A silence passed between them. Not awkward, measured. Logan shifted in his chair, then opened a new email. They're requesting a face-to-face before closing. Standard language, but they're pushing for in-person reps. Renee raised an eyebrow. From the tenants? Specifically the cafe manager, for operational continuity. She smiled. Perfect. Arrange it. I'll draft the reply. As Logan began typing, Renee stood and moved toward the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. The streets pulsed with motion below, people moving between jobs, between assumptions, between identities. She had grown up in one of those apartments that now sat above her cafes. She remembered how the doorman never opened the door for her mother, how the banks addressed her father by his first name, even in a suit. Back then, power had been invisible, something that happened in other zip codes, with other faces. Not anymore. Her phone buzzed. Huntley and Moss, 1:14 p.m. Request confirmed. Preliminary documents sent. Broker will coordinate site inspection. Seller confidential. She texted back one line. Let them know we'll be present for closing. Then she walked back to the table, rolled up her sleeves, and reached for the leasing map. Let's start with tenant assessments, she said. I want to know who's building something and who's just renting space. They worked for hours, reviewing terms, drafting offer language, calculating optional renovations that wouldn't disrupt the existing small businesses. She had no interest in gutting the building. She wanted to reframe it. By 5:30, Logan packed up his tablet. I can finish the vendor comparison from home. Send it before 9, Renee said. And remind Huntley. Dalton must be at the table. He paused. Dalton? She met his eyes. The manager, the one who asked me to leave. Logan stared at her for a moment, then nodded. Consider it done. She waited until he was gone before walking back to the window. The streetlights had come on, soft gold scattered across the pavement. A delivery bike zipped past. A woman with a stroller crossed the street. And the cafe, just visible from this height, still buzzed with people sipping wine and holding laptops. They didn't know it yet, but soon they'd be answering to the woman they didn't bother to see, not out of revenge, but out of ownership. The room was colder than expected. Renee noticed it the second she stepped inside, not in temperature, but in tone. Huntley and Moss liked their spaces like they liked their clients: clean, contained, controllable. Glass walls, sharp edges, leather seats that creaked at the wrong moments. At the far end of the table sat Langford, the representative for the family trust, already flipping through the closing packet. Beside him, 2 legal aides reviewed line items. Across from them was Nolan Dalton. He looked comfortable, relaxed in a way that only came from ignorance. He glanced up as she entered, gave a quick nod, the kind that says, assistant, not decision-maker. Then their eyes locked. There was a beat, a wrinkle of confusion, and then realization hit him like a soft slap, slow, late, unavoidable. He straightened in his chair. Renee didn't acknowledge it. She walked to her seat at the other end, opened her folio, and began organizing the documents she already knew by heart. Every page had been reviewed, every term negotiated. This wasn't a meeting. It was a reckoning. Langford cleared his throat. Dr. Marshall, thank you for joining us. As discussed, all final revisions are in place. Wire confirmation is pending signature. Renee nodded, flipping to the last page. I've reviewed. Let's proceed. Dalton shifted. Sorry, just to clarify, you're with the fund? She didn't look up. I am the fund. Langford blinked, unsure whether to interject. One of the aides clicked their pen, sensing tension. Dalton laughed softly, trying to mask discomfort. Wow. That's unexpected. I imagine many things are, she said calmly. He sat forward, fingers laced together. I think there's been some confusion. If I had known... You would have done what? She asked, raising her eyes to meet his. His mouth opened, but no sound followed. She didn't press. She didn't need to. Langford slid the documents forward. Whenever you're ready, Doctor. Marshall. She took the pen from the leather slot in her folio, signed with steady precision, each stroke silent but final. When she was done, she closed the packet and pushed it back across the table. The room was still. Mr. Dalton, Langford said, awkward now. As the lead tenant, you've been invited to acknowledge the ownership transition. There will be no operational disruptions at this time. However, the new management reserves the right to review all public-facing conduct. Dalton looked pale. I understand. Renee stood slowly. I doubt that. He looked up. You don't understand yet, but you will. He swallowed. Dr. Marshall, about what happened. What happened, she said, her tone like steel smoothed by velvet, was a choice, not an accident. Not a misunderstanding, a choice. You made it quickly, confidently, and publicly. His voice dropped. It wasn't personal. That's the problem, she said. It was structural. Langford began gathering papers quickly, trying to close the meeting before it cracked any further. One aide reached for the coffee carafe. The other avoided eye contact entirely. Renee stepped away from the table. Dalton remained seated, small now, adrift in a chair that had felt like power 10 minutes earlier. She walked past him, pausing just long enough to speak one final time. Next time someone walks into your cafe, you'll remember this moment. Not because of what I said, but because of what you almost lost by not listening. She left the room without another glance. The hallway outside was quiet. Her heels echoed against the tile. The receptionist looked up and offered a tentative smile, which she returned. Outside, the city buzzed. Traffic moved. Lives continued. The street looked the same as it had that morning, but something had shifted. Not in the skyline, but in the floor beneath it. She didn't go home right away. Instead, she walked 3 blocks south, turned the corner, and stopped in front of the building she now owned. Claret and Bloom still glowed from inside, ambient lighting casting soft gold against polished glass. The hostess at the front had changed, younger, maybe smarter. A man in a tailored coat opened the door for a woman in red heels. A barista laughed behind the counter. They didn't see her watching. She stood there for a moment longer, then pulled out her phone and opened the lease agreement. Scrolling down, she reached the clause she had added herself. Section 9.3, Code of Conduct and Representation. All tenant-facing staff must complete quarterly equity and inclusion training, with compliance directly impacting lease renewal options. She tapped the clause once, folded the phone shut, then turned, walked away, and disappeared into the night, not as a symbol or a statement, but as the owner. Down the block, construction crews began wrapping the scaffolding on her next site. Another historic building. Another place where people had been told they didn't belong. Soon they would. Because ownership wasn't just property, it was precedent. The email came quietly. No subject line, just a forwarded thread from a small business alliance Renee had once donated to anonymously. A new cafe was opening 2 blocks from where Claret and Bloom had stood. This one was different. It would be minority-owned, community-driven, built by people who used to serve coffee but now signed paychecks. They asked if she'd consider coming to the ribbon cutting. She didn't reply. Instead, she walked past the lot that afternoon, watching them hang the sign by hand. The letters were slightly crooked, the paint still drying. But the joy was real, hands in motion, heads tilted up, voices shouting instructions and laughter in equal measure. No one noticed her watching. She didn't need to be known to be felt. Her phone buzzed. Jalen, 2:46 p.m. You seeing this? Looks like your ripple turned into a tide. She typed back, not my tide, their ocean. She kept walking. Back at her own building, the lobby was filled with new faces. Young interns, visiting board members, non-profit partners from programs she had quietly backed for years. No one here asked who she was anymore. They just nodded, stepped aside, or smiled in recognition. She took the elevator to the top floor. Her office smelled faintly of jasmine. Someone had replaced the diffuser. On the desk, a leather-bound notebook waited, left by Jalen. Inside was a simple note in his handwriting. For the next name, they forget. Beneath it, a stack of blank pages. She sat down and opened the window. The city moved below her. Taxis, trains, people carrying too much, moving too fast. But somewhere in the noise, a balance had shifted. Not all at once. Not enough to fix everything. But enough to prove it could bend. She remembered the first apartment she and her mother had lived in. 1 bedroom, no elevator, heat that worked only on Tuesdays. And still, her mother made it feel like a fortress, walls of safety, ceilings of hope. Now, Renee built places like that for others, quietly, strategically, permanently. Her phone buzzed again. A message from someone she didn't know. The subject line read, "You don't know me, but you made space for me." She didn't open it. Not yet. Some acknowledgments don't need to be read. They just need to be received. Later that week, she walked past what used to be Claret and Bloom one last time. The space was gutted. The glass doors covered with craft paper, paint buckets stacked just inside. Someone had written across the brown paper in black marker, "Coming soon, a place for everyone." She paused, then took a pen from her coat pocket and wrote beneath it, "Make it better than we ever imagined." When she turned to leave, a boy, maybe 10, stood nearby, holding a sandwich in one hand, staring up at the storefront. "Did you used to work here?" he asked. She looked at him, then at the building. "No," she said, "but I used to matter here." He didn't understand, not yet. But one day, maybe. She nodded to him and walked on. At home, she removed her coat, placed her bag gently by the door, and sat at the piano she'd restored in memory of her mother. The keys were smooth now, the wood polished. She didn't play often, but today she pressed a few notes, soft, incomplete, but beautiful in their honesty. Outside her window, the streetlights flickered on. Below, someone held a door open for someone else. No one questioned it. No one made a statement about it. It just happened. And sometimes that's what justice looks like. Not loud, not lit up, but open. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. Sometimes real power doesn't come from shouting the loudest. It comes from walking back through the door that once shut you out and owning the entire building. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told you didn't belong, share your thoughts in the comments. Leave a like if Renee's story left an impact, and don't forget to subscribe. There are more powerful, truthful, and unforgettable stories ahead.